They didn't knock. They forced the door open at midnight. His mother grabbed one arm. He grabbed the other. The mistress stood behind them, holding spare keys. She fought. They dragged her across the floor and threw her into the cold driveway. The door slammed shut. Inside, they celebrated. Outside, her phone started ringing. Now let's go back to where this all started. Because to understand what Lenora did, you have to understand what they put her through first. The day they buried her father, the hall smelled like flowers and grief and somebody's sweet potato pie warming in the back kitchen. It was the kind of repast that black families know how to hold, full of people moving quietly, speaking softly, touching shoulders, pressing hands, doing all the small things that words can't carry. Lenora had organized most of it herself. She'd called the caterer. She'd chosen the centerpieces. She'd written the program for the funeral service and stayed up past 2 in the morning the night before, making sure every detail honored the man her father had been. That was just who she was. She carried things, quietly, completely without complaint. Her name was Lenora Elaine Pruitt, 41 years old, a woman who moved through rooms like someone who had already decided what mattered and let everything else fall away. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but if you watched her long enough, you started to notice something. She always seemed to know something more than she was saying, not in an arrogant way, in the way that some people carry knowledge, the way others carry grief. Close to the chest, private, protected, her husband, Marcus, was present the way a shadow is present. Technically there, but not offering anything. He'd worn the right suit and shaken the right hands and said the right things to the right uncles. But Lenora had felt his distance the way you feel cold air coming through a window you can't quite find. He kept stepping away to take phone calls. He kept checking something on his phone that he'd angle away from her whenever she got close. She noticed. She didn't say anything. That was a pattern by now. Her noticing and choosing her moment. His mother, Claudette, was a woman who had perfected the art of making you feel small without ever raising her voice. She moved through that repast hall like she was doing everyone a favor by attending, lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile, eyes that measured everything and found most of it lacking. She and Lenora had never been close. That was the polite way to say it. The accurate way to say it was that Claudette had decided long before this day that Lenora wasn't the right fit for her son, and she had spent 14 years collecting evidence to support that conclusion. Every holiday dinner, every family gathering, every small slight she could layer into the narrative she was building. Lenora was too independent, too quiet, too focused on work, not warm enough, not present enough. Not the kind of woman a man like Marcus needed. Claudette had been building that case for years. Lenora knew it, and she had let her build it because she understood something about patient people. They can afford to let others talk. The woman named Desiree had been introduced as a colleague, a work contact of Marcus's. She had no obvious reason to be at a funeral repast for a man she'd never met. But Marcus had brought her and offered no explanation, and the family had accepted her presence the way families sometimes accept things that don't quite make sense, by not looking at them directly. Desiree was composed and carefully dressed, and she held herself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she already knew how this story ended. She touched Marcus's arm once, briefly, when he returned from one of his phone calls. Just once. Just enough. Lenora saw it from across the room. She set down her cup of water so her hands wouldn't be holding anything. It was Marcus who pulled her aside, not far enough. They were near the hallway that led to the restrooms, and 3 of her cousins were sitting at a table not 10 feet away, and Marcus spoke in the low, practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed this, who had decided on this moment specifically. Maybe because he believed her grief over her father would make her less capable of fighting back. or maybe because he simply didn't think about it that deeply, which was its own kind of cruelty. He told her he wanted a divorce. He told her he'd been unhappy for years. He told her he'd already spoken to a lawyer. He said all of it in that measured, flattened voice, like he was reading terms from a document he hadn't written himself, like the words weren't his, like he was just the messenger. Lenora looked at him, not with rage, not with tears. She looked at him the way you look at something you've already calculated, already accounted for, already moved past in your planning. One of her cousins had gone quiet at the nearby table. She could feel the room shifting, that particular social shift when people realize something is happening that they're not supposed to be witnessing but cannot look away from. She felt Claudette's gaze from across the hall. Not surprised, she realized. Not surprised at all, which meant Claudette had known this was coming, which meant this had been coordinated at her father's repast. On the day they put Eldon Pruitt in the ground, she felt something move through her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more devastating than anger. The specific pain of realizing that the people who were supposed to be your family had decided you weren't worth basic decency, that they'd looked at her grief and seen an opportunity, that they'd chosen this moment on purpose. Her hands wanted to shake. She made them stop. She looked at Marcus one more time and she said, "You should have waited until Monday." Her voice was even, unhurried. He blinked, confused, and she could see him searching for the meaning behind the words and finding nothing. He assumed she meant emotionally, that she meant he should have given her more time after the funeral to absorb the news. He filed her words as something soft and wounded and moved on from them. He had no idea what Monday actually meant. He had no idea what was already done. She walked outside. She stood in the parking lot under a sky that had gone dark and full of stars that didn't care about any of this, and she breathed. From the outside, anyone watching would have seen a woman alone on the hardest day of her life, just publicly cut open by the man she'd built a life with, standing in a parking lot with nowhere to go. It looked exactly like the end of something. That was fine. Let it look that way. She drove home alone that night. The house felt wrong the way a place feels wrong when you already know you're leaving it. Now here is where you need to understand who Lenora was before all of this, not who she became, who she already was. Because the story people told about her, the story Marcus and Claudette had been building and polishing for years, was that she was cold, closed off, too wrapped up in her work to be a real partner, too independent to be a real wife. And the cruel thing about that story is the way it erases everything that came before it, the way it makes you forget the woman she actually was and what she actually gave. Her father, Eldon Pruitt, was a man of specific and quiet greatness. He worked in commercial real estate for 30 years, not at the top, not the man in the big office cutting the big deals. He was the man who understood the land, who read the surveys and the contracts and the market cycles with the patience of someone who believed that the ground itself was telling you something if you were willing to listen. He raised Lenora alone after her mother passed when Lenora was 9 years old. He raised her with books and early mornings and the specific discipline of a man who understood that the world would not be fair to his daughter, so he had to make sure she was better prepared than the world expected her to be. He used to sit with her at the kitchen table and go through documents, not as a lesson exactly, more like a conversation. He'd spread out a contract or a property assessment, and he'd walk her through it the way other fathers walk their children through baseball stats or music theory. He'd say, "Lenora, the person who understands the paperwork always outlasts the person who makes the noise." She heard that so many times it stopped being a saying and became something structural, something built into how she saw the world. She grew up believing that patience was not passivity, that silence was not weakness, that the most powerful position you could occupy was the one nobody knew you held. She had loved Marcus. That is the part of this story that deserves to be said plainly, without softening it or rushing past it. She had genuinely, fully loved that man. There was a version of their marriage 10 years in where he'd called her his quiet force and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Where he'd come home from a bad day and she'd already known somehow and had dinner ready and music low and would just sit beside him and not require anything from him while he found his way back to himself. She had supported him through 2 failed business ventures without a single word of reproach. When his first company collapsed, she had quietly reorganized their finances and taken on more consulting work, and never once made him feel small about it. When the second venture failed, she had done the same. She had loved him with the steady, undramatic love of a woman who understood that real partnership meant showing up, especially when showing up cost you something. At some point, the warmth between them had cooled. She couldn't name the exact moment. It wasn't a single moment. It was a drift. It was the slow accumulation of him listening to his mother more than he listened to her. It was Claudette's voice getting louder in his ear over the years, reshaping how he saw his wife, filing away Lenora's strength as a threat instead of a gift. It was Marcus's ego which had taken real damage from those 2 failures, finding it easier to resent Lenora's competence than to be inspired by it. The marriage had changed. She had felt it changing. And during the years it was changing. During the years he was drifting and Claudette was whispering and the warmth was bleeding out of the room. And during all of that, Lenora had been building something, quietly, carefully, the way her father taught her. She had not built it in secret out of spite. She had built it because building was what she knew how to do, and because some part of her had understood, long before she was ready to say it out loud, that she would need something of her own, something solid, something with her name on it, and only her name. 4 days after the funeral, they came at midnight. She heard the car first, then voices, Marcus's low and directing, Claudette's clipped and efficient, and a third voice she placed immediately as Desiree. She had time to stand up from the couch before the knock came. She opened the door, and there they were, just as they had planned it. Marcus with his jaw set and his eyes not quite meeting hers, Claudette already moving past her into the hallway like the house had already transferred ownership in her mind, and Desiree standing slightly back, a few feet behind, not gloating but present. Watching. The boxes were already packed. That was the detail that landed the hardest. The boxes, because it meant this had been planned before he told her, before the repast, maybe weeks before. The conversation in the hallway at her father's funeral hadn't been Marcus working up the courage to tell her. It had been Marcus executing step 1 of a plan that was already in motion. Claudette moved through the space with the specific efficiency of a woman who had imagined this moment and was finally living it. She directed Marcus about which boxes went where. She touched surfaces as she passed them like she was already claiming them. She didn't speak to Lenora directly, just moved around her like Lenora was furniture that hadn't been removed yet. Marcus watched Lenora gather a few things, her father's leather portfolio, her personal documents, 2 changes of clothes. He watched her and something moved across his face that he couldn't quite suppress. She was too calm, too unhurried. He had expected something from her. Tears, or confrontation, or at minimum the kind of wounded silence that would confirm for him that he had the power in this room. What he got instead was a woman who moved through her own home with complete composure, who made her selections without rushing, who looked at him once, just once, with an expression he couldn't read and couldn't shake. He almost said something. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. He didn't know what he would have said, and so he said nothing. but the silence troubled him in a way he couldn't name and didn't examine, because examining it would have required him to ask himself questions he wasn't ready to answer. Desiree believed Marcus. That is the thing you have to understand about her. She was not a woman who had set out to destroy a marriage. She had met Marcus at a professional event 8 months ago, and he had told her things about his marriage that painted Lenora as someone who had emotionally checked out years before, who was more committed to her career than to her husband, who had made Marcus feel invisible inside his own home. Desiree had heard a story about a man who was lonely in a marriage that had run its course, and she had believed it because Marcus told it convincingly, and because she had no reason yet to question the narrator. She stood at the edge of this midnight removal and felt something she hadn't expected to feel: unease. Because the woman gathering her things from this house did not look like the cold, checked-out wife she'd been described. She looked like someone absorbing an enormous amount of pain and choosing deliberately not to perform it. That distinction unsettled Desiree in a way she couldn't articulate yet, so she stayed quiet and stayed back and filed it away for later. The apartment Lenora moved into was small and spare and temporary, which was the word she kept using in her own mind. Temporary, because she needed it to be. Her friend Wren helped her move the few things she'd taken and brought food the first night and sat with her on the floor, because there was only one chair and they both agreed the floor was fine. Wren was the kind of friend who showed up. Lenora didn't have many people she trusted completely, but Wren was one of them, and having her in that small apartment in the first days made the walls feel less like they were contracting. The family, meanwhile, was getting a very specific version of events. Claudette worked a story the way skilled people work a room, methodically, strategically, leaving no table unvisited. By the time Lenora's cousins were calling to check on her, several of them had already received Claudette's version first. Lenora had always been difficult, always too focused on herself. Marcus had given that woman 14 years and gotten distance in return. It was sad, really, but sometimes these things just didn't work out. Claudette delivered it with just enough sorrow to seem like she was reluctant to share it, which made people trust it more. The story hardened before Lenora could offer any alternative. That was by design. Lenora's lawyer called her the week after the removal. He had entered conversations with Marcus's legal team, and the picture that was emerging from Marcus's side was that he expected a standard asset division. The house, the joint accounts, an equitable split of what he believed they'd built together. He had a number in his head. His lawyer had a number. It was a number based on a complete misunderstanding of what Lenora actually had and what her name was actually attached to. Her lawyer had communicated that there were assets pending disclosure tied to a corporate announcement. Marcus's lawyer had communicated this back to Marcus, and Marcus had told him it was a tactic, a bluff. He knew his wife. He knew what she had. He was certain of it. He was not certain. He just thought he was. There was a birthday dinner for Marcus's nephew, a 9-year-old boy named Curtis who had nothing to do with any of this adult failure and who had invited Auntie Lenora himself weeks before everything collapsed, because she always brought the right gift and always played with him like she meant it. Lenora had promised him she'd come. She kept her promises to children. She showed up at the house, stood at the door, asked for Curtis, handed him his gift, and crouched down to tell him happy birthday and that she loved him. Claudette appeared in the hallway behind the boy. She said, in front of the dinner table that could hear everything, that it was bold of Lenora to show up at a family event that she no longer had any part in. She said it with that pleasant poison that Claudette had spent a lifetime perfecting. Lenora stood up slowly. She opened her mouth. Something moved through her, the urge to answer, to defend herself, to tell every person at that table what had actually happened, at what occasion Marcus had chosen to announce the end of their marriage, whose repast it had been. who had stood in her home at midnight. All of it rose up in her throat and pressed against the back of her teeth, and she closed her mouth. She looked at Curtis. She told him she'd see him soon. She walked back to her car. She sat in the parking lot for a long time. That night, alone in the small apartment, she finally came apart. Not loudly. That wasn't how Lenora broke. She broke the way deep things break, slowly and from the inside, with no performance for anyone watching, because there was no one watching. She sat on the floor with her father's leather portfolio in her lap, and she cried in that voiceless way, the way that means the grief is older than the current moment and has been waiting longer than you realized. She cried for her father, who was gone. She cried for the marriage, which had been dying for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She cried for the woman she'd been, at that kitchen table with Eldon Pruitt, learning to read contracts, believing that patience would always be enough, that doing things right would eventually be seen. She cried because she was human and she had loved and been humiliated, and was sitting on the floor of a temporary apartment at 41 years old, and it was not supposed to look like this. The portfolio stayed closed on her lap. She didn't open it that night, she just held it. Wren called the next morning. She'd heard about the birthday dinner. She was angry on Lenora's behalf in the way that good friends get angry, fully on your behalf without asking you to manage their feelings about it. But after a few minutes, she said something that came from genuine care and genuine worry, which was that maybe Lenora should think about settling, taking what was fair, what was clean, and starting over somewhere new. Wren said, "I just don't want to watch you fight this for 2 years and lose yourself in it." The words landed with real weight because they came from love, and because some part of Lenora, the tired part, the part that had been holding everything for so long, heard them and felt the pull of giving up, of letting go of the bigger thing and just taking the small exit. There was a silence on that phone call that lasted long enough for Wren to ask if she was still there. Lenora said yes. She said she'd think about it. She didn't say anything else. She sat in that silence for a day and a half, and then she opened the portfolio. Eldon Pruitt had held a commercial property in a neighborhood that had once been dismissed as too far gone to invest in, and was now one of the most strategically positioned parcels in a rapidly developing corridor. He'd bought it for almost nothing in the 90s. He'd held it through every economic cycle, every developer who'd called him foolish, every year that people drove past it and saw an old building and not a foundation. He'd held it because he read the land, because he was patient, because he understood that value doesn't announce itself. It arrives eventually for the people who waited. He had left it to Lenora in his will, and she had known it was coming for years, because he had told her about it years ago in that same kitchen table voice he used for everything important. And when he told her about it, she had been in the middle of something. In the middle of 4 years of quiet, careful, strategic work that she had begun because she understood, somewhere in the part of herself that never lied to her, that she needed to build something that was entirely her own. She had built a holding company, structured in her name alone, advised by a small team of attorneys and a financial architect who had worked with her father and trusted her implicitly. She had acquired properties, studied markets, cultivated relationships with international development groups who were looking for American commercial real estate with specific characteristics. She had done it slowly. She had done it correctly. She had never done it secretly. It was all documented, all above board, all legal. She had simply done it without advertising it, because Lenora Pruitt had been raised to let the paperwork speak. Her father's property was the final piece, the anchor property of a 3-city commercial development project she had been building toward for 4 years. The deal was with Meridian Capital Group, an international firm with the capacity and the vision for exactly what she and her team had assembled. The total value of the completed deal was $10 billion. She had signed the final closing documents the afternoon of her father's repast. She had sat in a lawyer's office 3 hours before the guests arrived and put her signature on the most significant transaction of her professional life. And then she had driven to the hall and greeted the cousins and accepted the condolences and set out the food and watched Marcus take phone calls in the corner and felt Claudette's cold assessment from across the room and stood in that hallway and heard her husband announce the end of their marriage. And she had looked at him and said, "You should have waited until Monday, because Monday was when the press conference was originally scheduled." He humiliated her before the world found out who she was. He burned the house down 12 hours before the deed revealed she owned the whole street. The press conference was moved to the following Thursday when the venue became available sooner. Lenora's legal team notified all relevant parties. Marcus's lawyer received a formal notification of pending public corporate disclosure linked to the division of assets case. Marcus assumed still that it was a strategic maneuver. He prepared himself for a number. He was not preparing himself for what actually walked through the door. The hotel ballroom was full of people who worked in commercial development and real estate investment and urban planning, people who understood immediately the scale of what was being announced. Marcus had received an invitation through his firm. Meridian had listed his contracting company as one of several vendors on a subsidiary project, which was the only piece of this he'd ever been aware of, a mid-level contract that his team had fulfilled 18 months ago without him ever thinking much about who sat at the top of the organizational structure. He had brought Desiree because he thought this was a professional milestone, a moment of validation after his previous setbacks, and he wanted her beside him for it. He was relaxed when he sat down in the audience. He was not relaxed for long. Lenora came in from a side entrance, not the main doors that everyone else used, not with any kind of dramatic timing. She just came in from the side and walked directly to the presenting table and took her seat. She was wearing something dark and structured, and she had the expression of someone who was exactly where they expected to be. Nobody in that audience knew her face except Marcus, but when the MC stepped to the podium and began the introduction, Marcus heard her full professional name read into a microphone in front of 400 people, and the floor shifted under him. The MC explained the deal, explained its scope: 3 cities, 3 major development corridors, $10 billion in projected value, a project 4 years in the building, explained that the lead architect and majority silent partner had structured the deal's anchor around a strategically held commercial parcel whose ownership traced back decades. Explained that the silent partner, who was now stepping into full public professional visibility for the first time in connection with this project, had been quietly building the asset base that made this deal possible while serving simultaneously in advisory and consulting roles that nobody in this room had connected to this larger enterprise until today. Lenora's name on the screen behind the podium was not a revelation for the people in that room who knew the deal. For Marcus, it was a door falling off its hinges. He sat very still. Desiree was beside him, and she turned to look at him when the name appeared, and what she saw on his face was something she would think about for a long time after. Not embarrassment, not anger, but the specific expression of a man who has just understood that his measurements were completely wrong, that the map he'd been using to navigate didn't match the territory at all. She had described this woman to herself as absent from her own life, as someone who had emotionally vacated a marriage. And what she was looking at now, on that stage, was a woman who had been more present, more focused, more intentional than anyone in her orbit had realized. Only the presence had been directed at something none of them knew to look for. Desiree picked up her bag. She stood up quietly, without a word, without a scene, and she moved toward the exit. Marcus didn't watch her go. He was still looking at the screen. Lenora answered questions from the press with the quiet authority of someone who had prepared for this room for 4 years. She spoke about the development vision. She spoke about the communities the project would impact. She spoke about her father, about Eldon Pruitt, who had held a piece of land for 30 years because he believed in reading the ground and waiting for the right moment and trusting that what you build correctly will outlast anything built on noise. She said his name once, into the microphone, and her voice stayed steady. The room responded to that. You could feel it. People in that room who had never heard of Lenora Pruitt before that afternoon would remember her after it. She never said Marcus's name, not once. She never looked in his direction. She didn't need to. The press conference was not about him. It had never been about him. That was the most powerful thing she could have done, and she understood it in her bones. Marcus sat in that room until most of the seats around him had emptied. He sat with the stillness of a man doing a long and painful accounting. 14 years. She had been beside him for 14 years. She had propped up his ventures when they failed. She had reorganized their finances without complaint. She had built something. 4 years of building, right alongside the daily life they shared, right alongside the dinners and the arguments and the slow cooling of the marriage. And he had never seen it. He had looked at her every day and constructed a story about who she was, a story shaped by his mother's voice and his own ego and his own need to believe that the competence gap between them ran in his direction, and the story had been wrong from the beginning. He had evicted a woman from her own life the night before the world found out who she was. He had chosen the repast of her father, the man who built her, to announce that he was done with her. He had done all of it based on a fundamental misread that was irreversible and public and permanent. He drove home alone. The house that he had moved Desiree into was a house that Lenora's attorneys had already flagged in the asset disclosure documentation. There would be conversations about that. There would be many conversations. But that night there was just silence. In the weeks that followed, things unwound the way things unwind when the foundation was always wrong. Gradually, without drama, with the particular grinding quality of consequence that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives and stays. Marcus's vendor relationship with Meridian quietly concluded. Not in retaliation, Lenora's new leadership structure had different partnerships, different needs, and Marcus's firm simply did not fit the forward profile. His professional network, which he had never understood, overlapped significantly with Lenora's world, began to see him with different eyes, not with contempt, with a quiet reassessment that was, in some ways, harder to absorb than contempt. Invitations slowed. Calls went longer before being returned. The texture of his professional life thinned in ways he couldn't point to directly but could feel accumulating. Claudette's world contracted too. One of Lenora's cousins had been at that repast, had heard Marcus in that hallway, had known what day it was and what occasion it was when he chose to say those words. That cousin spoke to someone in the church community that Claudette prized above most things in her life, and the account of what had been done spread the way truth tends to spread in close communities. Not loudly, not as scandal exactly, but as information that quietly changes how people see you when you walk into a room. Claudette's phone didn't stop ringing, but certain rooms got cooler. Certain women who had always greeted her warmly now greeted her carefully, which is a different thing entirely, and Claudette knew the difference. She had built enough social architecture in her life to recognize when some of it was being quietly disassembled. Desiree, 6 weeks after the press conference, reached out through Lenora's assistant. Not an apology exactly, more an acknowledgement, a communication that said in so many words that she understood now that she had been given an incomplete picture and that certain things had been framed in ways that she had accepted without sufficient question. Lenora's assistant received the message. Lenora never responded. That silence was a full sentence. It said everything it needed to say, without costing Lenora anything, which was exactly how she preferred to spend her energy at this point in her life. There was a morning, about 2 months after the press conference, when Lenora drove back to the property. Her father's property, which was no longer just her father's property, which was now the cornerstone of something that had already begun construction, that would reshape a neighborhood and create the kind of lasting change that Eldon Pruitt had always believed in. She parked and got out and stood on the sidewalk in front of it on a quiet morning, and the street was mostly still, and the air had that early quality that belongs only to people who get up before the world makes its noise. Wren pulled up behind her 10 minutes later. She didn't say she was coming. She'd just known, the way she always knew, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and stood close enough that their arms were almost touching, and that was the whole apology for telling Lenora to settle. And Lenora accepted it completely because she understood that Wren had said that from love and from worry, which is different from saying it from selfishness or from a belief that Lenora wasn't capable. She stood there and thought about her father. She didn't think about Marcus. She thought about a kitchen table and a document spread out across it, and a man's patient voice explaining that the ground tells you things if you're willing to listen. She thought about what it cost to wait, what it required, not just patience as an abstract virtue, but patience as an active discipline, practiced daily, sometimes at enormous personal expense, in the faith that what is built correctly will eventually reveal itself. She thought about the repast hall and the parking lot and the midnight knock and the apartment floor and the birthday dinner and the phone call with Wren and every moment in between when it would have been so easy, so human, so understandable to break, to perform, to answer, to let them see that they had gotten to her. She was glad she hadn't, not because silence made her better than anyone, but because silence had kept her strategy intact. And her strategy had built something real, and something real was the only answer that was ever going to be enough. Anything else, any speech, any confrontation, any moment of public pain would have been temporary, would have given them something to point at, would have reduced her to a character in someone else's story about her. The paperwork told the story she wanted told, and the paperwork didn't exaggerate, it didn't perform. It just stated what was true, clearly, without apology. Some people confuse your silence for weakness. Let them. Silence is just strategy wearing patience. The woman who knows what she's worth doesn't need to announce it. She just lets the paperwork speak. Lenora took a long sip of her coffee. Wren said something about the way the light was hitting the building. Lenora agreed that it looked good, and it did. In the early morning, in the good light, with the construction already beginning to shape the space around it, the thing her father had held onto and she had built from, it looked exactly like what it was, a foundation, solid, correctly made, built to outlast everything that had tried to speak louder than it. If this story moved something in you, if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, hit that like button, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because we tell these stories for the ones who stayed quiet and still won.